Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Material Matters with Grant Gibson. That's still me. As regular listeners will now know, the idea behind the show is I speak to a designer, maker, artist or architect about a material with which they're intrinsically linked and discover how it changed their lives and careers. I'm currently sitting across a meeting table from Andrew Waugh, one half of the Shoreditch-based architecture practice Waugh Thistleton. We first met a little over 20 years ago when the practice was best known for working on a string of incredibly fashionable bars, clubs and restaurants in East London, such as the Blue Note and the Air Brothers. Spool forward a couple of decades and its profile is rather different. Arguably, this can be put down to one material and three letters, CLT. Andrew first started building with cross-laminated timber in 2003 and has gone on to forge a global reputation with projects such as Murray Grove, a 9-storey timber tower in Hackney, for which the practice won an RABA President's Award for Research in 2009, and subsequently the nearby Dalston Lane development. In 2018, the practice was shortlisted for the Sterling Prize for its Bushy cemetery. Andrew, was that all right?
Yeah, it was great.
Thank you very much for doing this.
20 years.
I know, it's a worry, isn't it? It's a worry.
Man and boy.
So, this is a podcast about materials, as I think I just laid out.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily listened to by architecture experts. So can we explain for people what CLT is?
Yeah, sure. Cross-laminated timber. And it's a panelized timber product that comes out of a factory about 16 meters long by about 3 meters wide. And those panels are then cut down and are formed to make walls and floors and roofs, lift shafts, staircases. So it's like they arrive on site like a big kind of Airfix model, and then they're craned into position and a couple of guys on site with cordless screwdrivers go round and screw them all together. So it's very simple, solid means of construction. So these panels, I should say, are made up of laminated timber planks. Each one of those planks about 25 mil an inch thick, and then they are laid down, they're sprayed with a PVA water-based adhesive, and then the next layer of planks go perpendicular to that layer of planks, and they're built up at sort of 90-degree angles, if you like. So that can be any depth from about 3 of those, so that would be 75 millimeters, 3 inches, or all the way up to a couple of feet thick, depending on what they're doing. So if you're building a multi-story car park, then then the planks might be 2 foot thick, and if you're building a wall between a bathroom and a bedroom, maybe they'll be 75 mil thick. So it just depends what they're doing.
Has anybody made a multi-storey car park out of CLT?
Yeah.
Where was that?
There are 2 that I know of, one in Finland and one that's going up at the moment in the west coast of the United States. But actually just keeping a finger on it, keeping an understanding of everything that's going on in the world in terms of CLT at the moment is becoming increasingly difficult.
Do you see yourself as a bit of a guardian of this material now?
Not a guardian as much as kind of, I'm fascinated by the rise of this material. I have become quite close to a number of other people that are working with the material across the world, which has been really exciting. I mean, it's been a fabulous kind of journey the last 15 years or so. When we built our first building in 2003, as you said, there was just a couple of thousand cubic meters of this material made a year. This year it'll be 1 million, next year projected to be 2 million, 57 different manufacturers in pretty much every continent.
I mean, can we lay out for people what the benefits of the material are? You've alluded to them, but can we kind of make it clear?
There are 3 principal benefits, in my opinion. The first one, and where we come from as a practice, is around sustainability. So concrete and steel, the production of concrete and steel account for about 15% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So that is, just to put that in perspective, that's about 5 times more than airline travel. So that's just the production. Then taking those materials to site, building with those materials, incredibly heavy materials, materials that need to be protected in many ways, and also materials that are very, very difficult to recycle. So those materials are not sustainable. These are not how we will be able to build in our future. We need to change the way we construct our buildings. So the construction, the refurbishment, the maintenance of buildings, nearly half of our carbon emissions in the UK. So this is a really important time for architects to reappraise how they build, what they build, and even if they build. And so that's one thing. The other thing is that it's really fabulous to work with a kind of prefabricated process. So rather than arriving on a kind of mucky building site with bits and pieces of stuff to put together, we actually have a prefabricated construction system that can build any type of building, that arrives on site on the back of a truck, goes up very quietly, very quickly. A mass timber building will weigh about 30% of a regular building, and so much reduced foundations, about 80% reduction in deliveries. And these buildings can be repurposed. They're very easy to adapt. So imagine you want to put a window in, you get a chainsaw out. It literally is that easy. We've done it. We're putting in a staircase in a building now that we finished already, and we're putting a new staircase in that building, and we're actually chopping the floor slab out and using that floor slab to make the staircase.
Just picking up on the lightness. If it's lighter, presumably wind becomes an issue.
Wind is an issue. So designing with CLT, designing with a material in mind, is principally about wind. So, if you think that a tall building is like a vertical cantilever, like a diving board on end, so that the weight of that building is quite easy to hold up. But if you build a long, thin building, then then unless the material is very rigid, then the building will kind of suffer from the wind. So we tend to propose an architecture that mitigates that kind of wind.
How?
Usually by building lower buildings, by building buildings that kind of, if you like, they're kind of ziggurat up.
Right.
Do you see what I mean? So they're kind of like, there are various ways of just understanding wind. So, we are learning a lot about wind and thinking about, and I think also for the first time in a few generations, really, we're thinking about the construction materials that we build with and how those materials affect the architecture. Now, I don't think architects have really done that, since high tech. I think that was the last time that there was really any proper material investigation in architecture.
Well, that's an interesting one because for this podcast, I'm constantly looking for people who are, as I said in the intro, intrinsically linked with the material and architecture. You could have said that for brutalism. You might have had Dennis Lasdon. If you took brick, you could have had Louis Kahn. You're right about glass and steel. But it doesn't seem to be, other than CLT, practices who you readily associate with one material nowadays.
No. There is this kind of, the 50 shades of brick.
Yeah.
That are kind of like obsessive at the moment. It does my head in anyway. But there's kind of like, which seems to be, what my generation of architects is obsessed with for their whole career. But, I agree. Absolutely. I think that, the thing is, the relative simplicity of building a building in concrete and steel, building a building that you kind of make a mold for, then you pour the stuff in, then you take the mold off, then you build another building around it. That kind of process of construction has been something that architects haven't needed to really understand. You can see that in the relationship between architects and engineers. You think about the relationship of Joseph Paxton, to the engineering profession, and you look at kind of contemporary architecture, which is where engineering has become a kind of problem-solving exercise, where the architect will kind of sketch something willfully on the envelope or fag packet, throw it across the engineer, say, I'm off for lunch, can you, work that one out? And the engineers kind of like, I think have been complicit in that, in the sense that they've kind of, become these problem solvers, So we do not want to work like that. And when we start to work with engineers, we sit down with them at the beginning of a job, and they're like, oh, we're not usually here at the beginning. We try and sort of like work things through with them and talk to them about what we're interested in, and to try and understand the engineering kind of parameters of the architecture that we're looking at. So that's I think really quite a different process from the one that contemporary architecture has become, has become used to.
Can we spool back to 2003, the first time you used the material? I think for a violinist's house. Am I right in saying?
It was actually a violinist's private membership club.
Ah, okay.
A membership club for classical musicians.
Why CLT in that first instance?
So we had a guy in the office who worked with this guy called Paolo, and Paolo had seen cross-laminated timber in some magazine or something, and the two of us went down to this place, this kind of hippie materials kind of workshop place in South London, and we pushed our way past the straw bales and the sheep's wool insulation, and there in the corner was this German guy who's still one of my closest friends, and here he was selling this amazing material. And the closer we looked at it, the more we thought about it, the more I got excited about it. The idea that what we drew would be what arrived on site, exactly, to the millimeter, so that we could draw on our kind of CAD programs, that same kind of file goes to the factory, and the material that arrives on site is actually kind of like millimeter perfect. So that kind of process of construction where the architect draws something, the builder looks at it, throws the drawing away and builds from memory, which is frankly how much of our life had been at that point, is sort of, it's really transformed to this accurate process where the architect has this kind of intrinsic link to actually what is built on site, which was, I found, immediately exciting.
But then you didn't use the material again until 2000, 2007, 2008 when you did Murray Grove, which is
No, we built a couple of little houses in the
you?
meantime. Yeah, we did. And we were trying to kind of persuade everybody. I mean, the thing is, I talk to architects in other countries about working with CLT, and architects in Germany or Canada or the US, and they have a massive timber industry in those places. And an architect kind of puts their head above the parapet and says, I'm interested in, using timber. And the timber promotion agencies start throwing money at them, and the government goes, wow, how amazing, yeah, good. But in the UK, nothing. So, we've had no encouragement, no help, no backing or anything to do the work that we've done. So we've had to get, and frankly, even the sustainability arguments have really just been, generally rejected. That's beginning to change now, but we've had to learn over the last 15 years how to build timber buildings more cost efficiently than a concrete building or a steel building could be built.
Well, can I ask why? Because it's quite interesting. I see you on various YouTube films being completely zealous about this material. You finish the film thinking, why would anybody build anything else?
Yeah.
So why has it taken the UK so long to get their head around the material?
I don't know. Do you know what it does me? I have no idea. I mean, for me, it's like, we know what construction, therefore architecture, we know what that impact is on the environment. We know how bad cement is in terms of its carbon emissions. And yet architects will go on, architects go, well, dear oh dear, I've got to use a lot of concrete, so I may as well be a vegan and not use plastic straws. I mean, good God, that is just so pathetic and kind of, it just, anyway. But so I don't understand why this hasn't been taken up. Why actually, we're not all doing this. I mean, we've demonstrated clearly as a practice that it's possible. We've had, of the 20 plus buildings that we've built in cross-laminated timber, we've had maybe 1 or 2 clients come to us and say, we're interested in building in timber. The rest of them had to demonstrate that it was more cost effective than building in concrete and steel. And we've done that because we were really concerned about the implications of our architecture on the environment. So I don't know why it hasn't taken off. It's taking off in other countries. In Paris, the mayor of Paris is pushing for all new development to be done in timber. When we went to the GLA earlier this year, and began to talk to them about embodied carbon, the GLA were like, oh no, we don't really think that that's a good idea. We tried to get the UK Green Building Council to back us. Not even they would back us then. I mean, I think the argument has changed. What Extinction Rebellion have done in changing the conversation, and what, now architects declare, You can see the government coming behind this. So I think things are really changing just in the last 6 months, which is really exciting.
But it's interesting because I remember we did a talk in Interbuild in Birmingham, which was a very glamorous site to do this kind of thing, about Murray Grove when it opened. I remember you saying that the developer didn't want people to know that it was a timber building. That attitude hasn't changed by the sound of it.
It is changing.
Right.
It is changing. So at that time, the developer was really concerned that if people knew that it was built of timber, they might not want to buy it. They might not want to live there. But actually what we know now and what we've been able to demonstrate to people is that actually people will pay more for timber buildings. They will rent them for higher rents, and they will actually make active choices to live in buildings and to work in buildings that are demonstrably better for the environment, better for our planet.
This goes down to the Three Little Pigs, doesn't it? One of them lived in sticks. It fell down. We're taught from a young age.
I know. It's perception. It is a perception issue, which is really frustrating.
Let's talk about the perception of CLT.
Well, the problem is fire. It's always around fire. And, that has been, that perception really has been definitely more of an issue since Grenfell, and something we need to work hard against. I mean, the truth of it is that, all construction materials are combustible. Concrete buildings burn down, we know that. And timber is a combustible material, like others. But because of people's perception around timber, I think, and because of the necessary understanding about safety in buildings, timber has been tested to the nth degree. So we're constantly fire testing the work that we do. Every project that we do has a fire engineer on it. I live on the 7th floor of a timber building myself, of a CLT building. So, with my family.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about this because it really has changed your life. I mean, both professionally, but also personally.
Totally. Yeah, totally. I mean, this is kind of like, I'm quite architecture obsessive, I suppose. I mean, I do, and I grew up in Milton Keynes, and in Milton Keynes, I remember really vividly when I was a kid, that all the architects were designing all these buildings in Milton Keynes, but living in the thatched cottages all the way around the edge of Milton Keynes. So I thought that was so hypocritical. So when we started really getting into CLT, really getting into kind of mass timber construction, and there are other types of engineered timber that we work with as well, I thought, I need to live in a building made of this.
I mean, fascinated by Milton Keynes because you like cars. Is that where the interest in cars came from?
Yeah, I do like cars. I've got an electric one now.
Oh, have you?
Yeah,
because I was going to ask about that.
Yeah, I've got an electric one now. I don't eat beef or lamb. I'm still on a bit of chicken. I'm cutting down the fish. I mean, I'm trying to get better. I wasn't a natural kind of, I wasn't a natural sustainable person. Yeah. So it's, I do like cars. And anyway, that's in the past. No, I still like cars, but I like electric ones.
Fair enough. I was actually, interestingly, one of the first and only owners of a Sinclair C5 back in the day.
Wow.
Which is probably a story for another podcast.
Yeah, really.
What I was going to ask is, you kind of sit in quite an interesting, almost in-between space architecturally. There was a fascinating column you wrote for Building Magazine a few years ago where you said that often prize-winning architects, I'm going to quote you, consider that the clinical pursuit of aesthetic finesse and brand identity is important beyond all other considerations. What a state of affairs. So aesthetics, what role does aesthetics play in your practice?
I mean, we are an architecture practice. First and foremost, our job, our professional duty is to build buildings that are functional, pragmatic, beautiful, and beauty, space, light, materiality are inherent to our pursuit as architects, without a doubt. We're not saying, times are hard, time for some self-flagellation, you have to have ugly buildings, bad spaces. I don't believe that. I mean, I don't, like the electric car. I love my electric car. I love sustainable buildings. I've never thought that it has to be a hair shirt. I never thought that this is just something that we need to consider, and that needs to be part and parcel of our practice. We need to be part of the solution and not part of the problem as architects. It's no good to just purely pursue this aesthetic kind of end. The other thing as well is I think that an aesthetic pursuit without any kind of cultural narrative behind it is really hollow. You know, that's why the kind of 50 Shades of Brick bother me so much, because it's really kind of, you know, it's like some sort of cultural toy robot in the corner banging itself kind of against the wall. Do you know what I mean? It's got nowhere to go. You know, so it's actually getting quite onanistic in its kind of like, you know, and it's sort of like self-obsession. I kind of, you know, so that does wind me up. And I, you know, and I have, you know, have become unpopular at dinner parties because of that. Also because, you know, the thing is that architects who are interested in sustainability have traditionally occupied a peripheral place in the architectural community. You know, they design birdwatching centres and, you know, and sort of politely kind of, you know, drive, you know, old-fashioned cars and whatever. Do you know, it's kind of like, you know, they sort of, and they have that kind of hair shirt kind of aura around them. But, you know, we from really, you know, from day one when we started really getting interested and really thinking that this should be an important part of our practice in architecture, have been very vocal about the fact that this needed to be a mainstream pursuit. You know, we need to work for Berkeley Homes. You make a small change in Berkeley Homes, and that the implications of that are massive. You know, there's not straw bale houses. That is not the solution of the urban housing crisis. You know, this is, or hempcrete. I mean, Christ.
Okay, well, let's get back to the timber.
It's a great product. I'm not saying it isn't.
Let's get back to the timber, because you've been working on it with it now for 15 years, obviously. I mean, has the way that you're using it changed in that time? Mm-hmm. How?
We got better at it. You know, we've got better at it. We've got better at detailing it, better understanding how it works. We use a lot less than we used to. We probably use about 20, 30% less timber per square meter than we were doing 10 years ago or so. So we got good at being more economic with it. We began to understand how to incorporate different types of, harvested hardwood and like beech or birch, looking at glue lams, looking at different types of doweling, different types of jointing. I mean, you know, we've got really interested in the kind of in the technology of the material. And we've worked with, you know, modular housing factories. We've worked with CLT factories. You know, we've worked with different kind of manufacturers. So we've really begun to understand the supply chain. Because for me, you know, any advance in construction has to come through designing with your supply chain. You know, you're not going to come up with a bright idea and then wait for industry to meet you. You know, you need to be working with your supply chain.
I mean, this is interesting because I was going to talk to you about whether your role in projects has changed. I was at the Vitsu factory, the shelving manufacturer, do Dieter Ram's products in Leamington Spa, a building that you were involved with, but you were kind of collaborating on that. It wasn't you as architect saying what should happen. So has your role in projects changed in that sense? You know, it sounded almost like you were brought in as the timber experts.
I mean, we were brought in on a number of, you know, we were brought in as part of a team, I think is probably a more accurate way of saying it. Sure, you know, we worked very closely with Mark Adams, the owner of Vitsu, who had some really, you know, really beautiful, clear ideas. I mean, the man has really great clarity.
He's very precise.
Oh, he's a fabulous guy, and it's a great, great product. And working with him, working with James O'Callaghan from Exley O'Callaghan, who has all that kind of amazing structural expertise, and with Martin Francis from RFR, you know, ex-RFR, who is, you know, I mean, fabulous person to work with and incredibly talented. So you had actually 4 people involved in the design, in different aspects of the design, sometimes, or, you know, actually, you know, a real combination of skills and talents. And certainly, I think for us, it was very important, and I think for me, very, you know, career-wise, very interesting to work in a situation where you weren't actually the leader of that situation. Do you know what I mean? It's like the architect's generally kind of head of the table, et cetera, but actually we weren't at that. And that's really healthy, I think.
Smells fantastic as well.
Thank you. I do like a good smelling building.
The most beautiful smelling factory I've ever visited.
Our construction sites always smell great. Our buildings smell good too. Pine fresh.
Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, this you used LVL, laminated veneer lumber.
Yeah.
What did that material bring to the project?
It's incredibly strong. So it's one of the newer kind of types of engineered timber. It's using hardwood veneers. So instead of cutting planks, I mean, the problem with planking a tree is that you're cutting square things from a round trunk, so it's not very efficient. And also if you imagine that a tree is like a kind of a vertical bundle of straws, and as soon as you begin to cut those straws, you weaken them. Whereas if you peel a tree all the way around, then you get to use 85% odd of that tree, and you're not cutting those straws, you're peeling it round. So the material that you end up with is a lot stronger. So a piece of LVL in section is as strong as a piece of steel. So it's a fabulous material. We love it.
As we kind of discussed, that CLT has transformed the practice. When we first met 2 decades ago, which we're not really discussing, but you were best known for doing these bars, restaurants, clubs, often in artist houses, often in Shoreditch. I mean, was there a deliberate choice to rebrand, to look at different areas?
There was a choice. It was deliberate. It was deliberate, and we Anthony and I kind of jokingly refer it to as our kind of black urinal moment, where we were in the office studio late one night and I was trying to find a black urinal on the internet, and I just thought, what am I doing? This is ridiculous. This cannot be the sum total of 7 years at college. It's whatever. It's like, so it came from that. I mean, these are kind of post-rationalized stories, isn't it? But it's like, and it was certainly something that the practice, evoluted into, if you like. And that has come, I guess, with the way that we run the practice, or that we've set the practice up, is probably a more accurate way of putting it, in such that, it's a talking shop. It's always been about research. And actually, funnily enough, even when you're doing, bars and nightclubs, you're always looking for the next thing to do. So that kind of, I think, definitely breeds that kind of feeling of innovation within a practice. And so that's definitely been part of what we've done as a practice. But you know what? We started straight from school, straight from university. So we didn't really know how to build. So actually, when we began to build buildings, we approached that in quite a basic sort of tectonic kind of fashion. So thinking about the building materials that we were going to build with, because we didn't know what we were doing, was a kind of, was part of a quite, I guess, predictable evolution of the practice.
Because you and Anthony met in Kingston.
Yeah.
I mean, did you never want to work for anybody else?
No.
Why not?
I don't know. I think maybe it's just a personality disorder of some sort or other. I wasn't very, and I think that because I have people that work in the studio here that are just the most fantastic, amazing, talented architects. And I think, right, how can I make this environment so that how can I build an environment in a studio where you are able to thrive as an individual architect? Because, I mean, I worked for Sandy Wilson in my year out.
Who did the British Library.
Who did the British Library, yeah. And that was a really kind of, very special, fundamental kind of time for me in terms of my development in practice.
Why?
Well, because he was really, really good. He's just such a talented, amazing person. And I think that there was nothing pretentious about his practice. There was only passion and joy and studiousness. It was kind of relentless, the working, the sketching, the thinking, the discussing. And I found that just wonderful. And I really enjoyed working there. I worked at KPF for a while as a model maker. I really, when we were first setting up here in practice, I really loved the kind of, the sort of the detail and the intricacy and the making of model making. But that was really, I mean, barring other holiday jobs, that was really, the only places I'd worked in. So when Anthony and I set up, we didn't really know how to run a practice. We had no idea about drawing issue sheets and stuff. I mean, only when we began to employ people that had worked for other practices and they came in and said, what, you don't have a title block? And we're like, a what? I'm joking. But, it's kind of like, so we really had to learn, what VAT stood for, etc.
Yeah.
No idea at all.
I'm intrigued by the Sandy Wilson thing, because he famously used to hang out in the Colony Room in the 50s with artists in Soho.
Yeah. And I
And you used to hang out.
I was a member of the Colony Rooms.
Oh, dear.
Yeah, I was a member there until and in the 90s, and when I'm just trying to remember who worked behind the bar. Who worked behind the bar? Was it Sam Taylor Wood used to work behind the bar, or Sarah Lucas? Sam Taylor Wood, I think. Anyway, it was so I used to go there.
I mean, he said he would have liked to have been an artist, and you were hanging out in Shoreditch in the 90s.
Yeah, I was.
With lots of the YBAs.
Yeah.
And would you have liked to have been an artist?
No, terrible bunch of people. Scruffy, scruffy ne'er-do-wells. I knew from a very early age that they were going nowhere, that they'd never make any money. I was just looking for a ticket out of Shoreditch as fast as I could go, I can tell you. Yeah, I got that one wrong.
I mean, can we talk a little bit about that time? Because it was a really interesting, I was kind of there, sort of-ish. Yeah. I can't remember much of it. But it was an interesting moment for the city and for lots of burgeoning careers, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a once in 100 years occasion, for a city to have that kind of explosion of artists. And I think that, it couldn't have happened really without that sort of perfect storm of social benefits. Everybody was on social security. That's how come they could paint without making money, and that's how come you could leave art school and just start to paint, is because you got social security. I don't think you can do that now. I don't know how you survive as an artist now.
But also you had huge spaces,
and you had
in the middle of the space.
You did in Zone 1, I know. And when I arrived in Shoreditch, thanks to Sarah Featherstone actually, but she was here already, and I was like, wow, this is Zone 1, and I can rent somewhere for nothing. And this is like amazing, lots of space. And that's why there were artists here. I mean, I didn't come here because they were artists. There were artists here, and a bunch of scroungers they were as well. So, but Damien Hirst, is probably his kind of genius around both, I think, as an artist and as somebody who wanted to understand the art market. Really was the kind of principal progenitor of all of that sort of. Of all of that sort of stuff, and and having people with the talent of the Chapmans and of Tracy M and Sarah Lucas. I mean, was amazing. Gary Hume, etc.
Because I love that anecdote about your first, which you did with Sarah, the Blue Note, you did with Sarah Featherstone.
Yeah.
You just literally jumped on the owners and said, let me design this iconic club.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I kind of saw them walking into the door, and I kind of followed them in, going, saying, everybody needs an architect. Come on, guys. And I think that I'd seen that level of enthusiasm from my friends that were artists. And as I was saying, when they finished college, they started painting. And I thought, well, I've finished college, I'll start building. Sarah was up for that as well. So we just started, and I think that kind of optimism, enthusiasm, and the self-belief that artists are trained to develop was really something that I wanted to emulate, something that I thought was kind of laudable.
I'm intrigued. Were you a good student? You're at Kingston.
No, terrible.
Why?
Terrible student. Biggest mistake of my life is how bad a student I was. I don't know. I really don't know. And I kind of, Sarah Wigglesworth was one of my tutors, and I mean, she's fabulous. Really, I think a great architect. And I could have learned so much from her, and I didn't. And I just didn't work hard enough. I don't know what it was. I think it was kind of, I don't know. It's a regret to me. I mean, I teach architecture a lot now, all over the place. And I loved that. I love teaching. And I love my job. Why I didn't work at college, still can't fathom. I think that I was just, I think I was a teenager until I was about 29.
Because when I think of, going back to Shoreditch, when I think of that time and place, there are a few practices that kind of spring to mind. You guys being one of them, David Adjaye, Will Russell being another.
Yeah.
I mean, David obviously has gone on to build huge museums in Washington and have dinner with President Obama. Did you always think he was going to be a star?
No, I didn't. But you know what? He went into practice after leaving Will. He went into practice with a marketing and PR agent, and I was at the time couldn't understand that. Now I understand it. Now I'm grown up. I understand what a kind of agility he had toward that kind of thing, how he understood that kind of thing so much more than I did. And as you say, he's gone on to do some really great work.
Was he one of the aesthetes you were talking about in that earlier quote, I wonder?
Not as clear cut as that, no. I think the thing is, David, to give David his credit, he has always really understood the ethos of his architecture. He's, I think the other thing is that what David had much more self-belief than I've ever had. And maybe that comes from being successful at college. I don't know. Or just believing in your own talent, or kind of, but that kind of, I think that level of self-belief really was a great driver for him.
But you must have self-belief. I mean, to set up in practice by yourself, to have 30 people working here now.
35.
35.
Do I? More and more, I guess. More and more. I mean, the problem with the practice of architecture is that it encourages you to become somebody who emanates this self-belief. Because if somebody's going to give you 50 million quid, you need to sort of come across as somebody who really is completely confident about what they're going to do with that money. Do you understand what I mean? So, and the thing about being 50 plus in architecture is that actually, I've been building buildings, drawing buildings, thinking about buildings for more than 30 years. So, yeah, there is some level of confidence that comes from having done that.
Are you still, relatively speaking, a young architect?
Relatively speaking to older architects.
But in other words, I guess, has your relationship with potential clients changed?
Yeah, it has. Yeah, suddenly you go into a meeting and it seems to weirdly happen overnight. You go into a meeting, you look around the table and you go, oh my God, I'm the oldest person here. And that just happened. And I don't know how it happened, but, I think the thing is that, you can see this from, the photographs of Norman Foster in his swimming trunks and sitting on inflatable unicorns. The idea in architecture, you've got to keep young, you've got to keep agile, you've got to keep your brain, your invention, your innovation, your imagination kind of working.
So we're coming to the end of our time. Future of the practice, Andrew.
Ooh, that sounds ominous.
Where do you see yourself going? I mean, obviously you were nominated for the Sterling Prize last year. Is the future still...
That was so important for us. That was really important for us because the thing is, we've been, as you said, we kind of had quite a high-ish profile doing all these nightclubs and bars and restaurants around town. And then we became these kind of timber obsessives, sunk ourselves in this hole for like 15 years. And then we do one building that isn't timber, one building that actually, well, that sounds an interesting project. Even though I'm doing this, I'm definitely going to have a go at that. We do one project out of a kind of vein of projects that we're doing, and it gets nominated for the Sterling Prize. So that was good, because then I think that reminded people that actually we're a design practice, and we've always been an architectural design practice.
Because that was rammed earth, amongst other things.
It was rammed earth. Yeah. It was. The buildings were made of rammed earth.
What's the technique, just for the listeners? What's the technique of rammed earth?
The technique of rammed earth is get a lot of earth, ram it.
Fair enough.
Okay. And if you can, get some Australians to ram it with you, because they're just the best. So. Where were we? What were we talking about? What is the future? Is it ominous? What am I going to be? Where do I see myself?
Let's talk about Bushy Cemetery for a moment.
Yeah.
Since we're there. Because why wasn't that in timber? Why the rammed earth? Why not in timber? Was that a conscious decision? Did the clients not want it?
No, it never occurred to me to build that building in CLT.
Right.
From the minute that working with Julen, who is the project architect, from the moment that the form of those buildings began to take shape, actually the idea of building them in rammed earth. I mean, the thing is, for us, we're about low carbon materials. The best low carbon material that I have come across is timber. But, the sketch is not timber, the sketch is low carbon, if you see what I mean. So in going back to the sketch, that's about what can we do to reduce our, how do we build reducing our carbon footprint? So actually, by taking the soil from the site, that we were having to, take off the surface anyway to help flatten the site. By taking that soil and building the buildings from it, You see, one of the amazing things, well, one of the kind of amazing things about that brief is those buildings will probably only be there for 70 years, because in 70 years' time, the cemetery will be full and they will move to another site. And those buildings need to kind of crumble back into the earth from where they came, dust to dust and all that. So that, I think, was very inherent in kind of, in the architecture, was the materiality of that space, of that place rather. But in terms of where we're going in 50 years, but in terms of where we're going as a practice, I don't know. I know that's not a good answer, but where we are now compared to where we were 3 years ago, I would never have dreamt that. I mean, we've got buildings in Sweden, Norway, France, United States, looking at other projects internationally, really beginning to get our voice heard in terms of a low carbon architecture globally.
Is that a contradiction,
amazing.
though, I wonder?
Hell yeah. Yeah, it is. It is. Yeah, it is. I mean, we carbon offset, and whenever I fly, I try and do as many things in that area as I can. So, if I fly to China, which I'm doing next week, for instance, I'm talking at an architecture conference about sustainability. I will also teach in China and meet developers in China and talk to them about sustainability. When I go to America to talk about our project in the States, I go and see my mum. No, but and we, I try and make very conscious decisions about what kind of airplane I fly in. The 787 has half the carbon emissions of a 747. All that, we carbon offset. But yeah, sure, it's one of the things that I can't see a solution for. And I don't know what to do about that. I catch the train whenever I can, whenever feasible. But you know what? I mean, it's 2 tons of carbon to fly to the States, right? And typically in our buildings will be thousands and thousands of tons of carbon, just locked into the timber. If we can change the global construction environment from a largely concrete practice to a largely timber practice, then the planet will grow more trees, which will suck more oxygen up. We will have a carbon store in our buildings. This is such a positive and important move that I don't feel as guilty as I could.
That's a lovely place to leave it. Andrew Waugh, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
And to learn more about Waugh Thistleton, go to waughthistleton.com. There are images from the interviews as well as little films and other things on my Instagram page, Grant on Design. If you've enjoyed listening and want to see this podcast flourish, then please rate and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to this from, and go to my Patreon page and make a pledge. You can find that at patreon.com/material matters. You'll be helping to take the message of the importance of materials, skill, craft and design to a whole new audience. Thanks very much for listening.